Hi, I'm Nikki with the Center for New Economic Diplomacy at ORF. Our guest today is Efosa Ojomo, Senior Research Fellow at the Clayton Christensen Institute for Disruptive Innovation. His work focuses on understanding how best to create prosperity in low and middle income countries. A native of Nigeria, Efosa studied engineering at Vanderbilt University and then got an MBA from the Harvard Business School. Efosa, thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Nikki. It's a pleasure to be here.
First up, I'd like to begin this chat with the story of the 10-year-old girl in Ethiopia you read about, which shook you up. You were so affected, you say, that you went back to the Africa you left behind and began constructing wells. I'd like our viewers to hear from you how that went, and then we can expand on it.
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. I think, like many immigrants who leave their home country for economic opportunities, I left Nigeria about 19 years ago to the U.S., came for college, and life was good here. I embraced the American dream after graduating. I got a job, bought a house, bought a car, things were going well. But then in 2008, I started reading books on economic development and poverty, and it gripped me like nothing had ever gripped me before. And the third book I read was written by a professor out of New York University. His name is William Easterly, and it's called The White Man's Burden. And it was trying to explain why many of the efforts from Western countries, well intended, but they just hadn't moved the needle on poverty alleviation and creating prosperity. And he dedicates the book to a 10-year-old girl whose name's Amarech. She's Ethiopian. And reading about her, something happened. It's hard to explain. I mean, it's just changed my life and the way I see the world. And it was that year I said, I need to go back to Nigeria to figure out how to fix this. So I started a nonprofit organization with the help of friends who raised tens of thousands of dollars. And we went back, we built wells, and the wells after a few months would break down. And I think for me, that was a very interesting experience because I was simply doing what I thought was right. I was doing what I had seen many other organizations do. And so I didn't understand how we would build a well and it would break down. And that was when I started to question that model, the model of going into a community, providing resources, and then hoping that everything sort of works out. And so it was a life-changing experience, the reading about Amarech, the 10-year-old girl. And I think it was followed on by several other learning experiences that hopefully we've covered in our book.
Efosa, I'm glad you kind of ended that thought there because early this year your co-authored book came out, The Prosperity Paradox: How Innovation Can Lift Nations Out of Poverty. One of the big themes there is you don't fix poverty by trying to fix it. And the push approach of good intentions does not always help, although it does sometimes. So in the African context, help us understand what does fix it.
Well, I mean, I think it's the African context, it's the American context, it's the Indian context, it's the Chinese, it's every context. It's the human context, really. What fixes it is innovation. But you see, innovation is really a buzzword. It means so many things to different people, so many innovation programs, innovation contexts. But we have to unpack what we mean by innovation. In the book, we describe how, from an economic standpoint, there are three types of innovations. The first type is market-creating innovation. And these are innovations that transform complicated and expensive products into products that are simple and affordable so that many more people in a society can get access to them. Simple example is the computing industry. 70 years ago, mainframe computers were big, expensive, complicated. Only a few big organizations had access. Today, many people around the world, billions of people, have access to computers. in their phone, in their pockets, right? It's smartphones. So that's, I think, is one. And those innovations are interesting because they serve as the bedrock and foundation of sustained economic development. They create growth, they create jobs, they create economic prosperity. The second type of innovations are sustaining innovations, which make good products better. And so this is when you get a much nicer version of a phone, a newer camera, more memory. They're important to keep companies and economies vibrant, but they don't quite have the same impact on organizations or on the economy. But they give companies nice profit margins. The third type of innovations are what we call efficiency innovations, and these are also important. These types of innovations help companies make good products cheaper, and so they are invested in so that companies can become more and more competitive. But they have a different impact on the economy. They actually tend to eliminate development because examples of these are outsourcing jobs or using automation. You can imagine when you do these things, there is often economic decimation of that region where jobs are outsourced. And I think what we've tried to do is say, none of these innovations is bad in and of themselves. I mean, efficiency innovations free up cash flow so that you could either give it back to shareholders or you could at least reinvest it into the economy. But you have to understand the portfolio of innovations you have. You have to understand the impact each one's going to have on an economy. And what we're saying in the book is there's a transformative power of market creating innovation. Instead of going into communities, pushing resources like the wells or schools or so on, if you really step back and figure out how to create a market for new products and services that would be more affordable to many more people in society, that market has a way of pulling in many things into the economy that would be more sustainable. And I think we try to explain that dynamic in the book, and we try to suggest that if the conventional development paradigm shifted from pushing resources to one where we create a market and a system that's able to pull these things in, I believe we would see the end of extreme poverty in our lifetimes.
Efosa, just hearing you talk about this, a lot of the fundamental basis is underpinned by the jobs theory of Clayton Christensen.
Yeah.
From whatever I've learned from some of his courses, I'd like you to now explain what are those jobs to be done in Africa. I know it's a large continent, 54 countries, but I'd like you to take concrete examples from what you've seen working already. Tell us what those jobs are.
So that there are a couple of ways to answer that question. One is to speculate, and the other is to simply look at prosperous countries. I mean, the fundamental thing is human beings are really the same, and so our circumstances are different. When an African immigrant or a Chinese immigrant or an Indian immigrant or whatever comes into America, the UK, France, wherever, they assimilate fairly well. They get jobs, they buy houses, they buy cars, they move around, they eat, they have insurance, they have all these things. And so it's a very interestingly easy way to see that jobs are really connected to the human experience. And so when I think about a whole continent of Africa, yeah, it's 54 countries, disparate cultures, but there's certain jobs that really are just fundamental to all of us. I mean, the job of spending time and taking care of your family, the job of, say, safety and security, the job of making sure you can provide for your friends and family, the job of communicating with people. And so to make this a concrete example, if you look at the continent of Africa about 20 years ago, less than 5% of the people had access to cell phones. And what's interesting is at that time, cell phones were still considered toys for the rich, even in rich countries or wealthy nations. To a lesser extent, but they still were not ubiquitous all over the place. And what we found is an entrepreneur by the name of Mo Ibrahim, who decides to go into Africa and say, hey, I'm going to pick several countries that are going to give me a telco license, and I'm going to invest in a mobile telecommunications infrastructure. He talked to his investor friends in London at the time, and they laughed at him, said he was crazy. There was no way it would work. Africans are poor, they've got AIDS, it's corruption. I mean, you name it, they gave it to him. But he was connected intuitively and in our language to the jobs people needed to do. And he looked at people, the way they live their lives. He said, look, guys wake up every day. There's no way to communicate. You want to go see your mom or your dad or your siblings, and you got to take several day journey. You don't know what they're up to. You just he was like, there's gotta be value we can create. And so against the advice of his colleagues at the time and major telco companies in the world who looked at Africa as a dirt poor continent, he goes in and invests. And the story is different today. I mean, for him, he's a billionaire, and in 7 years he was able to exit and sell his company for about $3.4 billion. But as interesting as that is, I think for us, what's more interesting is the effect that industry has now had in making mobile telecommunications simple and affordable to millions, hundreds of millions of people in Africa. That industry today is now worth almost $200 billion, according to GSMA, provides 20 plus billion dollars in taxes to African governments annually, and supports about 4 million jobs. And I think underpinning our research isn't really anything significantly complex. We are just saying, guys, what if we do for electricity what Mo Ibrahim did for mobile telecommunication? What if we do for maternal health what Mo Ibrahim did for mobile telecommunications? What if we do for affordable quality education what Mo Ibrahim did for mobile telecommunications? The solutions would look different, but that's the approach we need to start taking. Those are the questions we need to start asking, not how do we build infrastructure that resembles infrastructure in the US? How do we root out corruption so that investments can flow in? How do we build our institutions when there's really no foundation in the country that would accept those new Western style institutions you're building? That will never work. I mean, we've been doing it since, God knows how long, and we are no closer, quite frankly, to getting a society where economic prosperity thrives, because the approach, we believe, is well intended, but it's a little misguided. And we think understanding how innovation impacts an economy gives us the much better path to prosperity.
Tell us, what are the gaps that you see which need to be fixed urgently? What are the jobs to be done in Africa which you would say are priority, 1, 2, 3?
That's so let me take a step. I struggle to answer questions like that because they're often prescriptive, right? When you say these are the jobs, then people say, okay, let's go and fix that. Instead of that, I think it's more important is to look and see where are people struggling. And so there's high youth unemployment right now on the continent. And so you look at a lot of young people are struggling to find purpose and dignity. And that's a job we all have, right? But the solution isn't education. The solution isn't to grab a bunch of youth and try to put them through some program that gets them employed. But just looking at the region, you can begin to think about how you might solve other jobs that are connected to that one. So if you go into many countries in Africa, it's incredibly difficult to find skilled technical workforce.
And
And so
plumbers.
plumbers, electricians, generator repair people, things like that, right? And so that, but you see, that's not. I wouldn't necessarily say that's Africa's most pressing problem, but you can see how that is connected to this massive youth unemployment and youth bulge that we have. And so they're all connected. 50% of the continent is still living in rural areas. Poverty is on the rise. So a majority of people are spending most of their income on food. So there's definitely an opportunity to improve agriculture, food processing, distribution, logistics. But that's connected to the job of, look, I'm hungry, I want to eat, and I want to make sure my family is well taken care of. I want to feel proud about that, right? And so I think there are so many different types of jobs that I would consider fairly basic, quite frankly. But the solutions to those are where we need more innovation. The solutions are not simply to replicate what has worked in prosperous countries or what is currently working there. We think the solution is to understand how you can solve a particular problem that creates economic opportunity for many other people. And so, for me, it's hard to say this is what, these are three things the whole continent of Africa, because again, like you said, 54 countries, that's not the approach I would take. It would be more so helping people think about what we call in the book what non-consumption is. We have an example in the book about insurance. 15 years ago, if you asked anybody what some of the major problems were, I doubt many people would say insurance. But when you look at the way people live their lives and you study them, you realize, man, there's no access to insurance. And so we have to create a simple and affordable way for people to be able to guard against difficulties that arise in their lives. And MicroInsure has created an insurance product that's taking care of that. Now, where MicroInsure is today is not necessarily where it's going to be in 20, 30 years. It's going to grow, it's going to develop, but it's that approach that we think is critically important to solving the problem of poverty and creating prosperity.
Last question, Fosa. In the examples you found back home, have you found that innovations work best when they're started off in a small test scenario and then scaled?
My mantra is start small, learn fast, and grow big. I learned that from an entrepreneur in Nigeria that we talk about briefly in the book, Miss Anrewani of Wave. She's created an education organization that essentially trains young people and get them ready for the workforce. And you see, that's a very different take on education, right? She's not looking to build a school that gives you a degree that you're not going to be able to use to get work. I mean, that's a lot of what's going on. She's looking at this huge unemployment. Companies are saying these folks are not workforce ready. Let us train people, get them ready for the workforce, and then connect them to employers. Very different approach, right? Now, her mantra is, look, start small, learn fast, grow big. And I think the reason starting small is important is none of us is God, as far as I'm concerned. None of us knows and can predict the future. So when you start small, you can learn a lot and you can minimize your failures, because when you scale the good things and you scale the bad things. And so I tell people, don't scale too quickly because you will inadvertently scale the bad things. And nobody in their right mind wants to do that. But start small, learn fast, grow big is a mantra that is not a commandment. If you already know that you've got a nice secret sauce, you've got a recipe that works, then you go in and you scale quickly, right? I mean, Mo Ibrahim in 7 years had 5.2 million customers. It was making more than $500 million in revenue. Henry Ford, the first 10 years, produced more than a few million cars. I mean, you don't necessarily have to always, I'm going to start small, learn, if you have a recipe that works, then you can skip the first step, but you still got to learn fast and grow big.
Thank you, Efosa. Lovely conversation. Thanks so much.
Absolutely, Nikki. It's my pleasure. Thank you.